Welcome back. I'm Alfred Lambermont Weber, and today we have the extraordinary privilege of being with independent scientist Leuren Moret, who's coming to us from Berkeley, California. Welcome, Leuren.
Thank you.
Now, today, as I understand it, we'll be covering Putin's strategies in Ukraine and Russia's future and his concern for the re-sovereignty of all nations. It's the lack of sovereignty that is really destroying the nation states. And you'll be walking us through all of that.
Right.
Oh, excellent. Good. So, do you want to start back with the Orange Revolution in the Ukraine and the CIA takeover and a coup in Kiev? Is that a good place to start?
Yes, a little bit about the history of the Ukraine. The Orange Revolution in, I believe it was 2004, was engineered by George Soros. And he had systematically engineered, paid for, and started these revolutions, color revolutions, in the oil-rich republics that were part of the former Soviet Union, Kyrgyzstan, then there were a lot of countries there. I can't remember all of them. And then these colored revolutions moved on towards the Middle East, and there was one in the Ukraine. There was one in, was it Serbia? It was one of the areas of Yugoslavia, the former Yugoslavia. And then there was one in Egypt. Some of the Middle Eastern countries had them. And then, of course, we had Occupy in the United States, which is undergoing right now the overthrow of the sovereign nation of the United States. I'm watching it happen here in Berkeley. They are training American students and foreign students at the University of California at Berkeley to sabotage their own governments and overthrow their own governments. And at night, we can hear students at their own parties in the houses surrounding us gleefully talking about overthrowing the U.S. government. So this is also part of transhumanism, where these students are being subjected to neuro-linguistic programming, and the computers now are so advanced that they're actually, the cell phones are so advanced technologically now, the iPod for instance, that they are actually mind control devices. And it's very, 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 very frightening. It really is to see this happening, because now I understand what U.S. foreign policy, with the help of George Soros, has been carrying out in other countries, destabilizing them and overthrowing their leaders. Oh, they had one in Iran also. And when the youth rise up against a government with all these technologies and all kinds of psychological coaching and manipulating, it's like a bloodless revolution with an invisible army that you think are your children. And it's quite horrifying. So this is basically what the new warfare is about. It's hybrid wars. It's asymmetric warfare, because how do you fight it? And the U.S., it's the Anglo-American Permanent War Crimes Racketeering Syndicate again that is behind all of this. But at the very, very top, the Jesuits, of course, are running the whole thing. Now, Obama is Jesuit trained. All 7 of his intelligence chiefs are Jesuit trained and Catholics. 10% of Congress at least is Jesuit trained, and the Jesuits, of course, their headquarters is really the former Habsburg Empire, which was created or was the Holy Roman Empire, which the Jesuits and people before them, because they're rebranded, they the Eastern Roman Empire didn't collapse until 1400s, and these top Jesuits are actually Iranian bloodlines, ancient Iranian bloodlines. They wanted to reassemble the Roman Empire because they had created the Roman Empire. They were the Etruscan culture and society in Italy first. They razed and destroyed that whole society, their own society, selected those that they wanted to start the Roman Empire with, and proceeded to build the Roman Empire. When that collapsed, in the western part, it was much earlier, 500 or 600 years before the eastern part collapsed. And so the Habsburg Empire was created by these top Jesuit families, the Farneses, the Borgias, the Medicis, the Aldobrandinis, the Pallavicinis, the Gigis, and they run the Vatican Bank. There are many of them. They intermarried, and they produced most of the popes of Rome. Now, can you believe most of the popes of Rome were Iranian, Zoroastrian, Mithra worshippers, and they still are. And if you look at Washington, D.C. and the Pentagon, their signs and symbols are everywhere. So now, after doing this research and studying since last summer on these Iranian families, I realized that they've been running the planet for 3,000 years, and they just use different templates they've developed over those 3,000 years. And they've just been doing pumping countries, pumping cultures, creating them, harvesting them, and then dumping them, and starting again in another location. So these are cycles within cycles. These are templates they pull out of file drawers in the Vatican catacombs or wherever the Jesuit headquarters are. And the first one was in the Villa Farnese in northern Italy, which was built by Pope Paul III or Alessandro Farnese. And it's been very, very interesting because when I saw Villa Farnese, it's a 5-sided building and a fortified structure beneath it. That is exactly the plan for the architectural creation of the Pentagon in Washington, D.C. And in the War of 1812, the Farneses had the capital of Canada burned down and rebuilt with the signs and symbols they wanted that represented their interests and their projection of power. And they did the same thing the very next day in Washington, D.C. They burned down Washington, D.C. and rebuilt it with the Pentagon, an exact replica of the Villa Farnese. And there are signs and symbols of Zoroastrian and worship and Mithra, and then, of course, symbols of the ancient equestrian warriors who came out of Central Asia. They were among them. And the fasces, or it's a bundle of sticks with binding around them that were attached to the front of the chariots in Sumeria and earlier than that. And that came out of the Kazakh tribes and other tribes in Central Asia who brought these new concepts of warfare, of chariots. The original Central Asian chariots had 4 wheels. They brought those with the horses from Central Asia, Przewalski's wild horse that the Mongolians were famous for riding, and they introduced them to Elam, to Sumeria, to the Assyrians, to the Hittites, and they're even in the Bible. So those fasces are in paintings with U.S. presidents with symbols of Mithra. There are beautiful statues of Mithra throughout the federal buildings in Washington, D.C., and all of that is owned. All that property is owned by the Farnese family. So now we understand more about why the U.S. got involved in the Ukraine and why the U.S. is getting involved in with these SOCOMs, their groups of military operatives, sort of special ops, and we have them in 150 countries today. We are everywhere, and we represent the interests of the Jesuits, not the interests of the American people.
Right, right, and so this is a background on whose interest was George Soros acting, and why was there such a complete takeover of the Ukraine at this time?
Well, it's because Dick Cheney planned it in the Cold War.
I see.
And he even hired Victoria Nuland, who's the Undersecretary of State for the Ukraine and parts of Eastern Europe. And she's really, really disgusting. She's really horrible. She's a Russian Jew. Her father is on the faculty at Yale. His specialty is ethics and science. There aren't any. I'm a scientist, I'll speak for that. And I believe she went to Yale, but I'm not sure. And she was involved in 2 other revolutions in Egypt that overthrew the democratically elected leaders and replaced them with gangsters. George Soros or World Bank or IMF or Rothschild gangsters, who then betrayed the people, looted the countries of all the wealth, borrowed huge amounts of money from the IMF and the World Bank, and burdened these countries, just saddled them with huge debts that they could never get out of, and then reduced the people basically to really, really horrible slavery. And that is happening in the United States. I'm seeing it happen right now today. It's horrifying. And of course, the Ukraine situation in the largest country in Europe, which is the breadbasket for not just Europe, but also Russia and other countries. And it is the ancient steppe, or the grasslands, a belt of grasslands that stretch from the Atlantic Ocean across Europe, across the Middle East, across Central Asia, into Asia, all the way to the Pacific Ocean. And that has been a freeway or a highway or a transit route for thousands and thousands of years, at least 10 or 14 or 40,000 years, for people, tribes to migrate back and forth. And what is surprising, I got a paper on DNA on tribes in Central Asia, because I wanted to know who was related to who, and you can tell the DNA. If you know the DNA, you know the origins, for instance, of the Italians. Well, they're Iranian tribes from Central Asia from the DNA. And the Kurds, who are being so targeted for genocide, are also Iranian tribes. So are the Basques and the Hittites and the Elamites. And this is the reason the Kurds are being so targeted for genocide. It's because they are not Catholic, and they are also practice the original indigenous religion that is doesn't believe in evil, and it's quite different from Catholicism. And right now these top Jesuit families are assassinating, genociding all non-Catholic religions. And this is in order to convert them to Catholicism and then bring the whole world population under the Catholic Church, which they created. They are the popes of, they control, and of course the Jesuits are over the Vatican. They are atheists, they do not believe in God, they are an army, they're a military organization, and even Hitler patterned the Nazis based them on the Jesuit structure.
Right. So, strategically, what was their reason? That is, Soros, the CIA, to create a false separatist movement in the Ukraine through Kiev?
What they want to do is take over the Ukraine. It has 35% of all of the black soil in the world. One country, and it's because all of Europe, when it was covered with ice sheets, and the glacials and interglacials would produce huge amounts of sediment that was washed down into the Black Sea right over the Ukraine. So I wouldn't be surprised if that black soil doesn't go all the way to the core of the earth, because those glacials and interglacials have been happening for millions of years. But what it created was a huge, basically a plain, which the Ukraine is. It's part of the steppe, like our Great Plains. And the Carpathian Mountains sort of wrap around the northern part of the Ukraine through Poland and then into around the western edge of the Ukraine into the Baltic region. And the Carpathians have had a very interesting history, as well as the Ukraine, because all of the criminals and the runaway soldiers and the Teutonic Knights, the Ottoman Empire, everybody's been there. The Greeks had colonies there in the Crimea and in other parts of the Ukraine. The Vikings had settlements all up and down the rivers in the Ukraine and also Turkey. And you can see this DNA imprint from all these different cultures and people from many different places that mixed in these areas. And so you see Turkic faces and bodies, and you see blondes, blue eyes from the Baltics mixed in, and bright orangey red hair from the Vikings. And so all this DNA is not completely mixed and blended into a unified race. It's all still there and very obvious. It's very interesting. And so the Cossacks even have mixed blood with these early settlers there, but the Cossacks actually have been there for at least 20,000 years, because the burial tombs have Cossacks in them, also Scythians, and along with the men dressed in warrior clothing, the women were also warriors and fought beside the men or with the men, and they wear the same protective armor that the men wear. And these women represent the women that the Greeks called the Amazons.
Now, at some point, there was a pro-Russian president who was legitimately elected, who then was toppled, correct?
That would be Yanukovych, yes. And He was the president. Probably Putin helped put him in. He certainly had Russian approval. And he was an oligarch, very, very wealthy. And I'm not sure how effective he was, but as long as he was stealing money from the people and suppressing them, then Russia was happy. So it's a way to control countries on your border, is to put corrupt leaders in that you control, and then it makes it much easier to protect your borders. And what's happened is, over the last 20 years, or even longer, NATO has been encroaching on the Russian border. And of course, the last 23 years since the Soviet Union collapsed has been an opportunity for NATO to encroach even more, because a lot of the countries or the cultures that were part of the Soviet Union became independent. They got their sovereignty when the Soviet Union collapsed 23 years ago, including the Ukraine. But most of those countries had been independent before, so they had a better corporate knowledge of self-determination and ruling a country, running a country. But the Ukraine has almost never been independent. It's always been a part of the Polish Empire, or the Habsburg Empire, or the Russian Empire. But it's actually the Rus people who came down from Scandinavia and settled in the Ukraine first and built Kiev. They are the actual Russian people who are in Russia now. The Russian people in Russia now came from the Rus, from Scandinavia through the Ukraine into Russia. And the Ukrainians were highly educated. They were very advanced. They were much farther ahead of Russia than they are now. And it's what happened when the Soviet Union collapsed 23 years ago is every crook, thief, psychopath, compulsive liar, oligarch, greedy people, just all the predators jumped into the Ukraine. And the poor Ukrainian people, these are people like the Russian peasants or serfs who were relocated by Catherine the Great to eastern Ukraine to secure the frontier of Russia, or to secure this unoccupied area. And this is where the Potemkin villages were built for Catherine the Great. And of course, she used the Cossacks for her army. There was a 100 years war carried out in the Caucasus. The Cossacks fought that for the Russian aristocracy. And so this war zone in eastern Ukraine is called Novorossiya now. That was the old term for the Russian imperial dynasties, called it that. But it extended all the way across the north of the Black Sea to what is today Moldova. And this is part of the situation Putin is involved in, and he really has no choice. Anybody who's going in there into the Ukraine has control or power, like the United States now, and the CIA is very, very dangerous for Russia, for the survival of Russia. And so Putin has no choice. He has to deal with it. He has to take care of this issue. And I can see during the Soviet era and then the post-Soviet era that many things happened that shouldn't have happened to the Ukraine. It should have been put back under Russia, but for some reason it wasn't. The nuclear weapons that were in the Ukraine should have been returned to Russia when the Soviet Union collapsed, but they weren't. And there have to be reasons. It has to be part of a bigger plan that was on the table that people didn't know about for these kinds of things to have happened. So we're seeing the legacy of the Bolsheviks, and of course, something like 80% of the leaders were they were Ashkenaz Jews from Brooklyn, and they changed their names to Russian names, most of them, and went to Russia, carried out the Bolshevik Revolution. And by the way, March 8th is International Women's Day, and it's in honor of the Russian women who finally joined the Bolshevik Revolution at the last moment when the Bolsheviks were losing. And they changed the tide of the Bolshevik Revolution and won for the Bolsheviks. And for that reason, March 8th was named International Women's Day for the women, the Russian women.
Now, at some point, Maidan Square that we've covered before, where this was a false flag operation planned by MI5 and by the CIA, where the police were firing on the demonstrators in order to provoke a whole uprising, and that led to the coup, correct?
Yes, well, it started as an outcome of the Orange Revolution. The idea of Ukraine joining the EU and joining NATO was sort of the bait to get the Ukrainian people and the young people to join in on this overthrow. And it happened pretty fast because the Orange Revolution was in 2004 and Yanukovych was overthrown in 2014. So that's 10 years. And they corrupted the youth by bringing in American films, Hollywood films, and bringing in blue jeans and the whole American look and this promise of democracy. And they really thought that when they joined the EU, they would have this magical kingdom to live in with all kinds of benefits and more money and everything. And today, 1 year after that coup that overthrew the government, they are absolutely, the country's bankrupt. All the gold and everything has been stolen. The land is about to be taken by the EMF in a trading nature for debt scam, where countries that are overextended and have huge debts to the IMF because of crooked leaders borrowing the money and then the oligarchs stealing it and politicians. So the Orange Revolution did not work out for the Ukrainian people, but it sure did work out for all the thieves and con men and politicians, crooked politicians, and even the oligarchs.
Right. Could you describe how the Ukraine lost its gold?
Yes. Victoria Nuland and the CIA and Ambassador, let's see, what's his name? Pryak, something like Pryak. They went into the Ukraine. They filled up the entire bottom floor of the internal intelligence agency of the Ukraine with the CIA. The CIA brought neuro-linguistic programming, which they transmit through antennas, through television, through radios, through huge billboard screens that have live videos on them, all kinds of ways, through the cell phones and everything. And they convinced or brainwashed the people of the Ukraine to to push, to fight very hard, to demand their right to join the EU. And so this big movement was organized in the Maidan. The Maidan is an Ottoman word, or a word in that region, for the big square in the middle of a city, and it's where people came and gathered and talked and exchanged information, or they had celebrations. It was for social events. And so they had this Maidan Square was full of thousands and thousands and thousands of people waving Ukrainian flags and the Orange Revolution flags, and they were pressuring President Yanukovych to join the EU. He didn't want to. He didn't want anything to do with NATO either. And he had the support of Putin, of course, who was very wise about what the EU and NATO wanted from the Ukraine, and he didn't trust them. Well, he knew what they would do, which was to create a big mess, which is what is there now. So the Maidan Square event started, and there were sharpshooters from foreign countries. They look Polish, some of them to me. I've seen pictures of them. There were Mossad agents there. There were all kinds of mysterious groups suddenly appeared around the margins of the square and started shooting everyone. They killed policemen. They killed over 50 Blackwater mercenaries from the United States who were there. They killed the participants. It was just a shooting. It was a shooting alley for hours and hours and hours. Many, many people were injured. It was horrible. And so after that, there was another gathering later on in Odessa, which is the seaport down on the Black Sea, the coast of the Black Sea, on the west side of the shoreline of the Ukraine with the Black Sea. The Crimea is on the east side and has always been a Russian military base, Navy base. So anyway, there were demonstrations in Odessa, and people were camped out in this field, like a playing field of grass, and they had tents and everything. And people were sort of milling around one night, and they sort of started getting crowded and attacked by this crowd. They didn't even know who they were. And eventually, Molotov cocktails started flying, and they tried to hide behind a building, the United Unions building in Odessa, and then they were forced by this crowd into that building. And there were Israelis, I've seen videos of them, with t-shirts on that said chemist on them, and they were making Molotov cocktails and throwing them at the crowd, and even said so on camera.
Huh.
And there were others involved. No one's really sure. They're starting to find out that extreme right nationalists who are Nazis were involved in the murders, because hundreds of people died in that building. They were completely innocent people. They were not violent. Some of them were just walking through the field. They were just pedestrians, and they got swept into it. And so the perpetrators were throwing these Molotov cocktails. They had rods and sticks and guns and all kinds of things that they were beating the people they were shoving into the building. And some of them were dead before they even got up the stairs into the upper floors. There were also the domestic police called the Berkut. They're a special class of police. They do, for instance, intelligence for the Internal Intelligence Agency. They're very good at hacking computers and things like that. But they're honest for the most part, and they were being killed on upper floors. They were told to go out and deal with the crowd. They weren't even given guns. Their shields were taken care of them. So obviously they were set up and sent into a meat grinder. And over 200 people burned to death in that building. And still today, the perpetrators and the reason for doing it has not really been identified. It's really a tragedy. And from then on, just things went downhill. The coup got more energy and moved forward faster and faster. And it finally ended up in February. Victoria Nuland had already selected the new president, who was going to be the president, and the cabinet. And so they engineered a phony election. They installed Petro Poroshenko, one of the top Russian mafia figures, who had supposedly had a chocolate business, a chocolate factory. He was making $39 million a year that was publicly admitted to from a little candy store selling chocolate in the middle of Kiev. I don't think so. He's into human trafficking, prostitution, money laundering, drug racketeering, things like that. And he's the president of the Ukraine now. He was installed on June the 5th. Even John Kerry, the Secretary of State for the U.S., attended his inauguration. And from then on, everything went downhill. Actually, it went downhill from the time the new cabinet was installed. And the Prime Minister, Yatsenyuk, was sworn in on February 28th, I believe. And by June the 5th or 6th, he had, March 5th or 6th, around the time MH370, the Malaysian plane, went down in the South China Sea. He was installed as the Prime Minister, and he was already on a plane by March the 6th, a week later, with something like 40 tons of gold, or 20 tons of gold. Anyway, it was a lot of gold that belonged to the people of the Ukraine. And he was on his way flying to New York City, where he turned over the gold to JP Morgan Bank. And it's in safes, I guess, in the basement of the bank now. But that money will never go back to the Ukraine. And the very next day, I have photos of Yatsenyuk in the Oval Office with President Obama, and they're just both so happy and gleeful and yucking together and slapping each other and shaking hands and doing official photos. And then Yatsenyuk went back to the Ukraine, and it was quite a while, a number of weeks before that gold heist leaked out into the media through a Russian cafe publication, believe it or not. And then I guess that probably in my interviews I've done a lot to expose that, or the other people have too. Now that was just the beginning. Because the Kiev junta was an illegal government, and this would be Poroshenko, who took office on June the 5th with this new cabinet. But because the overthrow was illegal, a coup d'etat by a foreign country, the Cossacks in the eastern part of the Ukraine on the border with Russia live in a land that was granted to them in perpetuity by Catherine the Great, and the Potemkin villages are there in their area. The Potemkin villages are still there in the shelling and the destruction of the infrastructure. You can see these village houses that have walls, mud brick walls, over a foot thick. And it's such a tragedy to destroy all of that. But that's what the Ukrainian army is doing. And going back to the Cossacks, so 50 Cossacks in March or April picked up 40 Kalashnikov guns left over from World War I and World War II with, bandages or tape wrapped around the wooden stalks to hold the barrel onto them. And they started a separatist movement, and it wasn't very long before a Russian, well, he works for the FSB now, but it's the former KGB. So he appeared in this area and supported them, and he's a military man, so he also had a hobby of studying and acting out famous battles in history, Russian battles in history. And so when they really started fighting the Ukrainian army that was sent to put this revolution down, this civil war or this rebellion down, he led them in battles using the strategies from historic battles, and they were winning. Alfred, they shot down just with all they had. Finally, they kept capturing, surrounding and capturing big numbers of Ukrainian soldiers because they were not well trained. And they would take all their tanks, all their armored personnel carriers, all their heavy battery, their heavy artillery, all of their trucks, all the equipment they had, even some of their uniforms, and then they would release the Ukrainian army without all their gear and let them go. And then the Ukrainian government, Poroshenko, would go to Congress and Obama and ask for donations of equipment and money, and to England and to all the countries in the EU. And so this is now 5 rounds of the Ukrainian army being surrounded by the militia and losing all their equipment. So now the militia has more equipment, better equipment, and of course they're very, very careful. They're very good at taking care of their equipment. They're hardened warriors now, and most of them did not have any training when this started a year ago. So it's been an amazing process to follow and to understand that corporate history going back 40,000 years of being equestrian warriors, the first ones in the history of the world, is still there. And they are particularly good for transferring to this kind of warfare better than other kinds of traditional soldiers. And it's because of their cohesiveness and tribal ethics and structure that made them good warriors to begin with, and they haven't given that up. So for every Ukrainian soldier killed in some of the battles, for every militia killed in some of the battles, 300, up to 300 Ukrainian soldiers would be killed. So the Ukrainians have sustained horrific losses in terms of soldiers, and also there are a lot of accidents, shooting accidents that cause death in the Ukrainian military because the soldiers are untrained, and so they don't know how to handle their rifles, or they do stupid things, or they get drunk and shoot each other. Even whole battalions are out on the battlefield, Ukrainian battalions shooting at each other in the middle of a battle with the militia. So it's a Disneyland kind of environment with very bizarre things going on, and it's a tremendous amount of chaos with it's obvious now that this whole war there is actually a war to exterminate the Russian people, the civilians living in that region, because it's the richest industrial area, and plus it has a lot of coal mines, and most of the Cossacks work in the coal mines as coal miners. And it's been really, really, really fascinating. But it's also a great way to learn about the history of the region, about the resources of the region, the landscape of the region, and the politics of the region, the culture of the region, and also population under tremendous stress like this. And also, it's a great way to learn about Russia, about Putin, about internal politics in Russia, about the Russian people and how they feel about Putin. And that's important because Russia is on the rise now, and Europe is collapsing. The whole Western economy is. So the future is in the East. It's no longer in the North Atlantic.
Right, right. Now, in the course of this war that's been going on for about a year or so, this has had repercussions throughout the world. Is this what the let's call them the Western powers, or the let's call them the Axis powers? That's the only thing I can think of. Were they trying to start World War III? Were they just trying to make money on the war? What's their goal?
Well, the European Union is that was a sneak strategy to take away the sovereignty of European nations.
Right.
And it bankrupted the farmers in Europe. It put the countries under administrators. So instead of having elections for a government that the citizens had access to and could influence the decisions of, all of a sudden the decisions went under the EU, under administrators who never even see the people. And the administrators, the European Union administrators, get together and they vote among themselves. They're all shills for the New World Order anyway. And the people are cut out of the whole process of what was fairly democratically run countries, governments. And the Ukrainians were under oligarchs for the last 23 years. Before that, they weren't part of the Soviet Union. So they had no idea what to do with the oligarchs. They've always been they've always had a lot of corruption in the country because the Russian mafia did a lot of things in the Ukraine, and the Carpathians were full of all of these gangsters and sailors who ran away from ships and murderers, and that's where Dracula was from. And they stay in the mountains, but they come down and do their raids or parasitize the population and then go back to the Carpathian Mountains. But they're not really good for very much, but looting and stealing. So the Ukraine has some very dark forces on the border, and it's the western border into the north. And then they have the legacy of the Polish Empire and the Habsburg Empire, which was ruled secretly by the Jesuits. So the Jesuit influence is very strong in the western part of the Ukraine, and that's where the Nazi symbols and Nazi symbols and insignia came from, that started appearing on the tanks, the Ukrainian soldiers' tanks, kind of in the middle of the war, midsummer, June, July, and August. And I went, oh my God, where are those Nazi symbols coming from? Well, those were the soldiers who'd been recruiting in the west area, Galicia and Lvov, the western part of the Ukraine, with that tradition. And they were more destructive and more vicious Nazis than the German Nazis in Germany.
Right. And I also see the involvement here of a number of corporations that, through another line of research, we've been able to tie to ritual pedophile certain networks, ritual child sacrifice networks, ritual child trafficking networks, including Royal Dutch Shell up to the Dutch monarchy and the Dutch elite, Cargill in the United States, which reportedly holds ritual child sacrifice at the corporate headquarters, Monsanto, which is involved in all of this, the Rothschilds, which are connected in ritual sacrifice for over 100 years, and there's witnesses to all of this. So could you unpack some of that?
Yes. Well, the Ukraine is, there are two populations there. They call themselves ethnic Ukrainians, and they belong to the Eastern Ukrainian Christian Church. But that is actually under the Pope of Rome, like the Eastern Greek Christian Church. And the Eastern Russian Christian Church, Orthodox Christian Church, is not under the Pope because they left Italy in maybe 600 or 800 AD because they refused to submit to the Pope of Rome. And they relocated, this is still during the Roman Empire, to Constantinople, where there are very, very beautiful Christian churches there, the Hagia Sophia, with beautiful mosaics of religious figures, very, very beautiful. And eventually they relocated to, or they spread up into Russia. Now, in the Bolshevik Revolution, 100 million white Russians were murdered by the Bolsheviks. And this is part of the Jesuit plan to destroy all other religions and to bring those people into the Catholic Church or kill them, just genocide them. So the other population in the Ukraine are the ethnic Russians, who are not under the Pope. They are Eastern Orthodox Russian Christians. And they actually are the same people. They're all Russians. But the Bolsheviks made up the Ukrainian language and created this Hegelian dialect that people believe now that they're ethnic Ukrainians and they're different from ethnic Russians in the Ukraine. It's not true. They're all the same people. And so that has colored what is happening, but it's easier to manipulate that population that way. So the corporations that went in there now are exploiting that, and the Chevron and the Royal Dutch Shell had bought the right to do fracking and exploration for oil and shale gas in the Novorossiya region, which has deposits. But the Cossacks did not want fracking in their land because they knew it would poison the water in the land. And that's really what made them pick up the Kalashnikovs in April. It was because of the fracking more than anything else. Chevron also has bought exploration rights there. And there is a Russian oligarch named Kolomoisky, and he is the governor of the next big region, province of Dnipropetrovsk. And he has been exploiting the coal mines, and also he started a bank, Privat Bank, which he invited the son of Joe Biden, the Vice President of the United States, to be on the board of directors. And John Kerry's stepson has a roommate who was invited to be on the board of directors. So this is how Kerry and Biden are going to get their payoff for supporting the war in the Ukraine against the ethnic Russians. But in fact, it's really against everybody in the Ukraine, because it's the Rothschilds and the U.S. Jesuit-trained leadership who are operating in the best interests of the Jesuits. And this is where Cargill and Monsanto came into the Ukraine. Monsanto is owned by the Jesuits, and Cargill was started by the Jesuits. So there we have it. And they have purchased farmland as the value of the Ukrainian money has dropped almost to zero. So they're getting land very cheap, and they're planting GMO crops in the Ukraine on Cargill and Monsanto land, which poisons the soil, poisons the food, poisons the people, and accelerates the death rate. And the EU is completely opposed to GMO. They don't have GMO. They prevented it from getting into Europe. The Ukraine did not have it. The surrounding regions don't have it. They don't want GMO in Europe. And I guess somehow it got into Russia, but Putin has announced that he's phasing out GMO in Russia. And Russia has some of the most pristine, richest farmland that's never been farmed. And now, because of what's happened in the Ukraine, Russia can no longer purchase arms from the Ukraine. They were getting a lot of their arms from the Ukraine. The Ukraine has a lot of factories, arms factories. And they were getting a lot of food from the Ukraine. So they now have had to turn internally to develop an arms industry, and Putin said, we're going to make all our own arms. We're not relying on any other countries. It's all going to be internal, and we're going to be more self-reliant in terms of food, but it also helped Russia turn to look for other partnerships in importing and exporting around the world. So it actually, the sanctions and all the demonization of Russia and Putin in the media, the Western media, actually unified Russia, because this is an external enemy. It made the Russians go back to their Russian roots and their Russian culture and Russian pride, and to fight this enemy. And they have supplied a lot of humanitarian aid. The Russian people themselves on their own have sent humanitarian things, goods to the Novorossiya area, and Putin has been sending regular envoys of 80, 100, 200 trucks loaded with thousands of tons of food, rice, bread, flour, even building materials. He's been very, very, very responsive and very responsible, and he's been a lifeline to those people in most of the villages that have been in the war zone and in these battles. They're uninhabitable, and they can't live in the villages anymore unless they're in the basements, because the Ukrainian soldiers keep shelling all of the cities. And this is all from a distance. There's very little direct contact between the Ukrainian soldiers and the militia. But the Ukrainian soldiers go in and occupy the villages and then use the villagers as human shield, because they know the militia will not shell them or attack them with weapons in the villages, because they don't want to hurt their own people.
Now, there was recently this event, military event that happened in the Debaltsevo cauldron, And that was kind of a watershed event for this process that's been going on for about a year. Could you talk about that?
That was definitely a turning place for this. And what happened is there was a pocket, a big pocket, that of a Ukrainian-controlled land in the Novorossiya area that was under the control of the Ukrainian military, but it was in actually the militia region, the area they controlled. But there was this pocket formed, and at the bottom of the pocket is where MH17, Malaysian flight MH17, was shot down by the Ukrainian military. And that pocket, I went, why do the Iranians want that pocket? Why does the military have so many fortifications, and why are they so dug into this region? And then I realized when the Debaltsevo cauldron opened up and we could see what had been happening there, it's because the Ukrainian soldiers had fortifications all over in that pocket, and they were shelling all of the big cities and destroying them, and shelling all the villages around the outskirts of the big cities from this cauldron that had no militia in it to attack them and to stop them. So the militia have been handicapped the whole time by not being able to rout out Ukrainian soldiers in villages that where Russians live, because the militia didn't want to hurt them. And it's a meat grinder that has increased in the severity of damage to the infrastructure. They're just destroying all of the infrastructure of Novorossiya in increments, instead of just bombing them and dropping bombs on them and just destroying everything. They're doing it on the ground in increments and just encroaching more and more into the militia area. But the militia have other ways of fighting. They're very, very good with strategy. They're very, very tough. They really stay together. They stand there and they take the bullets. They don't give up their positions even when they know they're going to die. And obviously the Ukrainian soldiers who are being sent in there, they're not trained. Many of them have no uniforms. A lot of them have no guns. They're put on the battlefield with no guns. And then Poroshenko has provided no food, no vehicles or fuel for them to get around. They have to pay for it themselves, share a car, and 8 or 10 of them will be in a car sharing the gas money. And it's very, very bizarre. And these are these people, these poor young men, they were conscripted. They were kidnapped from buses, from bus stops, from stores, from schools, from villages, and just thrown into trucks where other kidnapped young men were locked in. And then they're driven to the front of the war and dropped off. And there are anti-terrorist units or battalions with machine guns that are behind all the soldiers. And if they try to escape or try to go over into the militia territory to surrender, a lot of them have joined the militia. 14,000 soldiers, just Ukrainian soldiers, just disappeared. And President Poroshenko said, we just don't know where they are. Well, they were either killed on the battlefield and the Ukrainian soldiers threw them into lakes at night, or they left them there and the militia would clean them up and bury them, or give them back to force the Ukrainian troops to come and pick them up. It's been really horrible. And then Komenoisky, who is the governor of Dnipropetrovsk, and he's involved with Chevron and Biden's son and Kerry's stepson, he has refrigerated trucks that he was sending to the battlefields in the war zone. And some of the dead soldiers, Ukrainian soldiers, in their camps, paperwork was found there, and they had been doing organ harvesting for Kolmonoisky of civilians, and they had lists of civilian names they were told to go and kidnap, and the medical record for each of those civilians was in the hands of the Army soldiers. Now, we're talking about organs that they're getting, Kolmonoisky is getting $6 million a pound for them. So this is a very, very lucrative business. Kolmonoisky is also a dual Israeli citizen, and not very long ago, a few years ago, a whole group of supposed Israeli rabbis, all these criminals call themselves rabbis so they get respect, and they were found to be running a organ racket in medical tourism, where they were arranging for Palestinian organs. They were doing the same thing to Palestinians in Gaza, and they were selling medical trips to South America, where these organs are placed in the patients who have paid horrendous amounts of money for them.
Yeah. So
this is
now
just part of the war, and Kolmonoisky is also running a big drug racket of these horrible, nasty designer drugs. One of them is called Spice, and Putin has just caught people in Russia smuggling it in. So there are all kinds of dirty things going on, and Ukraine now is one of the most corrupt countries in the world.
Yeah. Now, that kind of implies that there were deep roots into the international Khazar mafia that was behind the Ukrainian coup, and that has really went in there and set up shop there, and it's the same Khazarian mafia that is part of the attempted takedown of the U.S. Is that not the case?
And in fact, they're not Khazars. That was Kunstler who wrote a book about it, and it was just propaganda so that Israel could say, well, we're Khazars, and the Khazars lived in Ukraine, so that's our homeland.
I see.
We're going back there. But it was Jacob Rothschild who was behind it, and he had Israel depopulated. They've been horrifically depopulated and sterilized from the depleted uranium used in Iraq and Afghanistan, and also they're dropping it on their own border. The Israeli Defense Forces, I caught them in the attack on Gaza. They were bombing their own border with depleted uranium bunker busters on the day that the wind was blowing from the Mediterranean over Gaza and picking up that GU at the border with Gaza and blowing it right into Israel to further chronically expose the Israeli population to depleted uranium. So they're depopulating, their top leadership is depopulating Israel themselves, and the top leadership, these people are not Khazars, they're Tajik tribes, ancient Iranian tribes from the Tajik area, and the Uzbek Iranian tribes, who are part of the Habsburg Empire, and they're the top of the Jesuits. They took the Tajik tribes and made them, through breeding programs and religious change, into a victim population. But they're actually the perpetrators. And perpetrators always turn themselves into the victim. And so that's why these false satanic Kabbalah and Talmudic Jews that are causing all this trouble all over the world are actually sort of under contract to the Uzbek or the leading Jesuit families, the Farneses and so forth. And when you look at them, you can see that Asian blood mixed in. But they have the Uzbeks put them into experiences in ghettos and pogroms and they're way overbred. So they are mentally not as sharp. They're mentally ill. They have a lot of birth defects, trouble with their eyes and things like that. And so they are a very good army of synonyms or collaborators with those top Jesuits who are also Iranian tribes, but nobody knows this.
Now, how does that tie in with the force that has been taking over the U.S. through the Kennedy assassination, through 9/11, that Netanyahu and the top Israelis were part of, and that are now part of the takeover and occupation and extermination of the U.S. through Homeland Security? What tribal elements are doing that?
Oh, those are the Tajiks also, that victim society. And for the last 1,000 years, if people want to read a really good book, it's by, I've forgotten his first name, Ramsey. It's called The Nameless War. And he was a member of the British Parliament. He was a colonel or something in the military, Sandhurst. And he saw what was happening in the 1920s and 30s, and he saw World War II coming. Well, he didn't want World War II. He wanted to stop it. So he wrote this book, The Nameless War, about who was behind all the wars for the last 1,000 years. This is since the Crusades. And he was able to show a pattern and templates for every one of those wars. The Spanish Revolution, the French Revolution, the American Revolution, all of these revolutions were actually engineered by those people, these Tajiks or these satanic Jews. And that is exactly what's happening now. It's the same people, the grandchildren or the great-grandchildren, whatever, but it's a society that has that purpose for over 1,000 years. And they come in, they're called aliens because they come from other countries and come into the targeted country, or they are these satanic Jews who live in countries that they never have any loyalty to. Even though they may have citizenship, they're still aliens because they have no loyalty or interest in preserving or serving the governments of countries that they're living in, that are hosting them. And so basically that's who the Bolsheviks were. Most of the Bolsheviks were these satanic Talmudic Jews from Brooklyn who put on their masks and uniforms and went off to wage the Bolshevik Revolution so that they could kill 100,000 ethnic Orthodox Christians in Russia and to convert them to communism. Well, Putin has restored the Eastern Orthodox Church in Russia, but I'm not sure if it's the same. I don't know who the leaders are or what it's really all about, but he did do that and he felt it was very important. It's certainly a much better religion in a purer form of the original intended religion of Christianity compared to what we have now. And the churches today are all infiltrated. A lot of them are just political movements. They're horrible. But the religion's very, very important because that's how you control the masses.
Now you say that the U.S. is forcing the EU to bend to U.S. wishes, and EU and NATO are being bankrupted, but there's blowback from the EU now, isn't there?
Oh, horrendous blowback. And what happened is at first the U.S. and the EU were united, and the EU, I'm talking about mostly about the NATO countries. Well, something like 2/3 of NATO is American. It's a United States organization. But the three biggest members after the United States are Britain, France, and Germany. And I have a pie chart that shows who the members are and what percentage of the budget they pay for. And so the rest of the countries have very, very small stakes, 1% or 2%, very, very small, compared to the United States. And of course, General Breedlove is over there now as chief of NATO, and he's getting into a lot of trouble because he's inciting the war in the Ukraine. He's fanning the flames of it. He's saying, go in with nuclear weapons. Generals, American retired generals now are going on television. And now the European Union members, especially Germany and France, are getting very worried because what started out as a NATO and EU exercise has turned into something very different that's extremely dangerous for Europe, because now there are highly armed gangs of men that are coming out of that war, and private mercenaries and so forth, and the extreme right nationalists who are from the western part of Ukraine, and they are looting and wandering around shooting people, and they're a terrible threat now, even for the stability in the future of the Kiev junta, President Poroshenko and his cabinet, including Yatsenyuk. And they've even moved their families out of Ukraine. Poroshenko's families are in Germany. And I believe Yatsenyuk's family will probably go to the United States or to Switzerland. But Yatsenyuk apparently is a Scientologist, and his sister lives in the United States. The Scientologists were started by the Jesuits. It's a Jesuit organization. So there it is. Yatsenyuk is Jesuit controlled. And so these, I forgot what your question was.
Well, I'm just seeing that now. I'm just trying to see what is the end game in the Ukraine now. What was it? Just chaos to create the empire of chaos? Is there any end game there, or is it just that side has lost and the BRICS is really coming forward and that side is just disintegrating?
Well, what has happened is that this bucket of marmots coming out of Israel and the U.S. And other places have landed in the Ukraine, and they're positioned now to strip all the wealth, as they have everywhere. This is George Soros, who was originally born in Hungary. So these are Eastern European gangsters, and some of them are American citizens now. They're dual citizens, or they were born in Eastern Europe and now they're gangsters for America or whatever. But first of all, at the very top, the Jesuits want all of the land. They want to plant GMO. They want to poison that whole region and make it collapse faster, the European Union and everything. And so they want the revenue from all of that land, and they have experimental farms in Paraguay, in African countries. They started Cargill. They've done experimental farms in the United States. They tried to export or force GMO into Japan and the Philippines after Europe said no. And the farmers at night, I've talked to them, went into the experimental plots in Japan and the Philippines and stomped all the plants into the mud every time they were planted. So GMO isn't going over in Japan or the Philippines either. the African countries had shipments of corn, GMO corn, and other GMO crops sent to them by U.S. entities for the Jesuits. And the Africans said, "You cannot dock in any of our ports. We would rather die than eat that stuff." And that was the cover story on The Ecologist magazine a few years ago. And it was actually, the cover story says, "We'd rather eat shit or die than eat that stuff." So the Cargill and Monsanto had to keep looking for more customers or countries they could introduce the GMO to. Well, the U.S. went for it. I don't know if Canada does. I don't.
There's a struggle here.
Yes. So that's so Cargill and the Jesuits and Monsanto, they want the farmland. The IMF has made horrendous hundreds of billions of dollars in loans to the illegal Ukrainian government, and it can never be paid back. The Ukrainian people will never be able to pay it back, especially if they don't own any of the farmland. And they're changing all the laws on property ownership. They had, Poroshenko had a surprise election in October, and he replaced the parliament members who were opposing all these new laws and restrictions and taking away the social norms of civil society. And he replaced them with battalion commanders. So now Army battalion commanders are all over in the Rada, which is the Ukrainian parliament, and they're doing the most bizarre things. They're fist fights on the floor of the Rada every day. They just get up and fight with each other and push each other around. They have done hardly any work since this new parliament was elected. And meanwhile, the economy is bankrupt. And what the IMF wants to do is to load them, saddle them with as much debt as they possibly can, so that the Ukrainian government will be forced to trade their nature, their natural land, their commons land, for the debt they owe to the IMF. And of course, it's all funny money, paper money. It doesn't mean anything. It's just voodoo economics that's been set up by these Jesuits, the Vatican Bank and the Western bankers, to steal the accumulated wealth of every generation. And today, 85% of the world owns nothing. And 25 families, royal families, sovereign families, own 12.5% of the lands, of the earth's surface of the land. So what we're seeing is more and more rapid concentration of wealth, of land, of mineral rights into that elite on the top. And the poverty pyramid is expanding at an exponential rate, and more middle class and upper middle class people are being swept into it. It's just a horrifying thing to observe and to watch. And I'm telling you, Putin is our hero. He is the only leader in the world who's opposing this, and he had to learn how to do it, because all of the mineral resources in Russia were sold in one night by President Yeltsin to the same people. Jacob Rothschild ended up with most of the oil and gas rights to Russia, one person. And so Putin went in and he cleaned out all the oligarchs. They're all, I call them oligarchs, but they're all Ashkenaz Jews, all of them. And he stabilized Russia. The first thing he did was pay off all of the Soviet-era debt to the international bankers. 20 years early, they were furious. They wanted all the interest on that money. And then he has started a new international bank, the BRICS Bank, which stands for Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. And Argentina, I think there are other smaller members also, but that's about to open and open for business. They have their own system now for transferring funds to banks around the world because in the sanctions period when this Ukraine war, the West is blaming all of the war and the conflict and the misery on the Russian troops. Every day, Kerry and Victoria Nuland, spokesman for the government in the U.S., are saying that there are thousands and thousands of troops. They get fake photos of convoys going into the Ukraine, saying that's where they're going, and it's all nonsense. Russia is not getting involved in the Ukraine.
Well, Kerry belongs to Skull and Bones, which is the second chapter of the Illuminati.
That's right. That's right.
Founded in 1776.
That's right. So, and the Masons are involved in that. Knights Templars, it's all the same thing. It's all the same rebranding over and over and over of this game that's gone on for 3,000 years. So, so what's happened is Putin absolutely knew that if he dragged Russia into a war in the Ukraine, NATO would come in, the U.S. would come in, and there would be World War III. Now, France and Germany and other countries all voted for the sanctions. They all demonized Russia and Putin. He left the G20 meeting or the G40 meeting in Australia early because he was treated so badly and shunned and ridiculed and very hostile to him. And he wasn't able to resolve anything in the diplomatic negotiations, so he left. And
right. So what do you see as throughout all of these? What are some of the basic strategies that Putin has pursued, both in the Ukraine and in building Russia's future? I mean, he's driving these 13 families essentially off the face of the planet. So how is it that he is being able to do this after so much time?
Well, the Vatican Bank is backing the BRICS Bank, so he's in with those top level Jasons. You have to be. There's no other game on this planet. You have to be in negotiations with them or to give them some benefit or whatever. They're just the bosses, period. And however, he's been, he has a degree in international law. He's also a martial arts expert that he started when he was a child. So I have watched him use strategy, diplomacy. He's not going to do a military confrontation. He said it many times very, very clearly. The U.S. cannot survive without military confrontation, so it's really the U.S. behind this World War III effort to get that started. And Devalt Savo stopped all of that. You should have seen the faces of Kerry. He was ashen-faced when that battle was over. Poroshenko looked like he'd been drugging it heavy and drunk every day and every night for 6 months. He was so devastated. Obama was disappointed. And suddenly Merkel, of Germany, and Hollande, the president of France, realized how dangerous it was for Europe and for their own governments and countries. And they now are sort of leading a split between Europe and the United States. So I don't really know what's going to happen, except that that Putin is going to win because of how he operates. And so he has not done anything to provoke any retaliation or any aggression in the Ukraine from anyone involved there. And he has sent his own people in to organize a partisan movement in the Ukraine, so that it's like the militia, it's the Ukrainian partisans who will determine what happens there and whether the junta will be thrown out eventually. But I can see that there's a big partisan movement that's already started on the west side of Ukraine. It's coming across the Black Sea shoreline, and then the Novorossiya movement will be moving south towards Crimea, which they got their independence through a referendum, which is different, but these people will have referendums too. And the whole southern part, the whole coastal area region of the Ukraine is going to be part of Russia. It will be united as the Federation of the Ukraine, and these will be semi-autonomous regions. But even the Nazi regions in Western Europe are doing a separatist movement too, and then they will be brought into the Federation of Russia. Now, what will happen is when they nationalize, or when they become independent from the Ukrainian government of today, all that IMF debt, all the debts will stay with that that segment of the Ukraine, and the separatists will have none of that debt when they restart their countries and governments. So that's a very good thing, and probably the debt will end up with a very small part of the Ukraine, sort of in the northwest area where all the troublemakers are anyway. Now, one problem that has been really apparent is the effects of Chernobyl on the mental processes and the mental ability of the Ukrainian people. And I see it especially in the army, in these young men who are several generations after Chernobyl, and the brain problems, the birth defects, the damage to the executive part of the brain where impulse control is centered is now apparent. You can see it in the population. You can even see people who look like they have obvious facial defects, and the shape of the skull, and the proportion of the eyes to the rest of the face. It's all screwed up, and this is part of the big problem in the Ukraine now, which is also the same in the U.S., because we had 1,300 nuclear bomb tests conducted in our country on the American people by the U.S. government. And it's the same Khazars who did it, only they're not Khazars, they're Ashkenaz Jews. And so countries that are being exposed to these hybrid wars to high levels of radiation, or just residual low-level radiation, they're being destroyed. And I have an IQ map of countries in Europe, and in the Mediterranean and the Black Sea region, where most of the wind carried the radioactive dust from Iraq and Afghanistan, the IQ is lowered in all of those areas, and also the effects of the Chernobyl also occurred in those areas, because a lot of the plumes came south into the eastern Mediterranean and the Black Sea region, and affected Turkey and Iran, all the Baltic states. But where the Yugoslavian war occurred in Kosovo and Croatia, they've had a huge drop in IQ, and this is just since the 90s, and that's the most severe in all of Europe, and that's because of the depleted uranium carpet bombing the U.S. did in Yugoslavia, because of the concentration of weapons like dime and depleted uranium, fourth generation nukes, neutron bombs, tactical nukes. They really, really poisoned Croatia and Kosovo.
Right.
And
right.
Who tells the story?
Right. Now, we're coming to the end of this segment, but there's one topic that I would really like to get into, and that is the issue that you mentioned that Putin is really focusing on, and people all around the world are focusing on. In fact, Americans, awakening Americans, are focusing on, and that's the re-sovereignty of the nation. And could you explain how Putin is doing it? And then I'm going to ask you about the United States and the re-sovereignty of the United States.
Now, one of the biggest concerns and one of the biggest goals of Putin is to re-sovereigntize not just Russia, but countries all over the world. And I was so surprised when I read about him talking about it and how important it is. Well, remember, he does have an international law degree, so he does deeply understand these issues, but he also has some tools to deal with them and know how to get what he wants. He's in favor of a socialist government and good social programs in Russia, so that more people in the middle class and the lower class people in the country are very poor, but they're going to have more benefit and share more in the vast wealth that will come from the oil and gas deposits, not just in Siberia, but in the Arctic. And the Russian people, through those deposits which they own or they've claimed, they hold 25% of all the energy resources in the world. So they have a very good future. If Putin can keep Russia together, I think he can. He has a KGB background. He's dealt with gangsters his whole life. He knows how to deal with them. He flushed out all of the Ashkenaz gangsters who had stolen all the resources, the mineral resources from Russia, and they fled to either Israel or London. So guess who's doing it? Guess who's behind it? It's Israel and London. And Israel was created by the Jesuits. London is controlled by the Jesuits. Queen Elizabeth and the royal family are controlled by the Jesuits. So there it is, all roads lead to, not London, they might lead through London, but they lead to the Jesuits again. So this re-sovereigntization, giving self-determination back to legitimate independent governments, is Putin's primary goal. And what he's doing is cleaning off the table. All the breadcrumbs are going on the floor, and he's starting all over again, restoring nation states to their sovereign state and really giving back countries and freedom to their people.
Yeah, now let's turn to the United States, which some analysis says that since the Act of 1871, where the District of Columbia was created, which became a third city-state in the three city-state empire of the Vatican city-state, the City of London city-state, and the Washington, D.C. city-state, that it's a USA corporation, and that the function of the Washington, D.C. city-state is they're the military arm of this three city-state empire that I call VATLANUSA, for Vatican, London, USA. It's like Medusa.
Yeah.
So, and that's why the U.S. is at war all the time, and the American people can't figure it out. It's because they're the military arm of this worldwide kind of monster, and they think that they have elections and democracy, and they're just part of a corporate franchise, that has the franchise for their territory. And once every 4 years, they have a carnival that lasts 2 years. Here in Canada, the elections last 30 days by law. So there's an election coming up in 2016, and the fix has been in for a long time. As we see the second chapter of the Bavarian Illuminati, which was founded in 1775 by a Jesuit, Adam Weishaupt, was founded, the second chapter was founded in 1776 at Yale under the cover of Skull and Bones to capture the American Revolution, so that in a sense co-opted as an Illuminati project there. How do you think, being an American living in there and being, you know, at the vanguards of Americans who are recognizing that their country is being, you know, has been taken over and is being, through cadres, is now being occupied in a version of what I call Operation Phoenix from the Vietnam War. I mean, I'm from that generation. How do you see America being re-sovereigntized, or, you know, because is Putin doing this, or how is that going to happen?
Well, I don't have very much hope for the United States because I'm living right here in Berkeley, which is one of the very, very, very powerful arms of the octopus that is strangling the United States. In fact, North America, Canada, U.S., and Mexico. I don't think it's going to be as bad in Canada. But basically, it's the Jesuits. And the Jesuits, their favorite rackets are drugs, human trafficking, things like that. And some of these Jesuits from these Iranian tribes are, for instance, Leon Panetta, who his family came over from Italy, and his father moved to a village from a big town near Sicily. And in that town, it's a little tiny village that is the headquarters of the Ndrangheta Mafia. Now, what Leon Panetta did when he was in Congress, well, his family came to Monterey in the United States, which is a big Navy military international center, and there's all kinds of drugs and other things that the military do involved there. And his family started 10 or 11 restaurants, Italian restaurants, in Monterey. And so his father had to be in the Ndrangheta because every male in that village has to be a member of the Ndrangheta. And they have to intermarry with approved women. They want them to intermarry with village women and certain families. So Leon Panetta, I was looking and looking and looking at his face because I said, okay, Leon Panetta was Secretary of Transportation under Clinton. Well, Clinton is a Rockefeller through his mother. She was an illegitimate daughter of the Rockefeller governor of Arkansas. And Clinton built a Mena airport so that the Rockefellers could have China white heroin flown in big planes all day long to pay back. The Chinese are paying back their debt to the Rockefellers. They borrowed money to modernize China, and they're paying it back with China white heroin. Now, this is a special trade zone at that airport, and no law enforcement or government forces can enter or in any way interfere with the activities going on. So China white heroin is picked up by Tyson chicken trucks or Walmart trucks and distributed throughout the U.S. That's going on, and that's a very big Jesuit activity. But Panetta went from transportation under Clinton to the chief of the CIA under Obama, but only for 2 years. So he set up the CIA, and he reorganized and redesigned the Ndrangheta from a local little village mafia family to an international organization that resembles, he redesigned it to resemble the structure of the Medellin cartel in Colombia and the Mexican cartel. And it's much more sophisticated, much more money and so forth. And just to make sure that my hunch was right, I started Googling Panettas in the Italian press from that village. And Alfred, every one of them was sitting in a police car with her in handcuffs for drug charges. So then Panetta went from the CIA, which it's been taken over by the Jesuits anyway in 2002. Then he went to Secretary of Defense. Well, that's the military. They're involved in all the drug trafficking. So I went 1, 2, 3. Those are all, Jesuit and drug trafficking and everything. So I knew what Panetta was. So then I took a picture of him to a dinner party where some Persians were. And I said, do you think that Leon Panetta, I think he's an Uzbek. I think he's an Arabian Uzbek. Look at his bloodline, and he's obviously from a breeding program. And I looked up Panetta, and there was a link to Panettas in the north of Italy on the border with Austria, which is Habsburg Empire. And they were actually a princely family, princes of the Habsburg Empire, just using the Panetta name as a cover story. So there we have the Jesuits again. And Fidel Castro, I started investigating him. Why was he's a Jesuit, why was he in Cuba? And he's always said, oh, we're Jews and we were conquistadors and this and that. So I started investigating him, and I said, gee, he sure looks like Alessandro Farnese. Alessandro Farnese was Pope Paul III. And so then I got a picture of a painting of Castro in a black hat, very austere, in a black robe. And I put the picture of Pope Paul III from the 1500s. He started the Jesuits, and he built the Villa Farnese as their headquarters. And then his son, Pier Luigi Farnese, who was a military man, and he was sent to the Netherlands to quell the Protestant movement there. Then I got some other Farneses, and my God, Castro looks exactly like them. And it was Castro's father who brought the family, who emigrated to Cuba, and all of a sudden he was supposed to be an agricultural worker in Spain, picking artichokes all day in the hot sun. Well, I looked at the town he came from, supposedly in Spain, and it has the finest Roman architectural walls of any city in the world. So I said, oh, that's Farnese, all right. And then in another place, I found a reference to Castro's father, and it said he came from Piacenza. Well, Pope Paul III made Pier Luigi and his ancestors the Dukes of Piacenza, the Dukes of Castro, and the Dukes of, I think it was Parma. And so that's when I started investigating Castro, and sure enough, his family are the Dukes of Parma, of Piacenza, of Castro.
And in fact, you showed me the planned portrait.
Yes.
The retirement portrait of Castro, and it's identical. Could you talk about that?
Yes, it's identical to what the others are wearing in portraits, and he looks like a Jesuit dressed in all this black, a Spanish one. So I knew right away that this had been painted while he was live, and after he dies, they will add the coat of arms and the other descriptive things that would go on that painting, and that will go into the family palace in the north of Italy, in Piacenza. So it's very, very interesting. Then I was talking to the Iranians that night, and they said, "Oh, well, didn't you know Stalin was Persian? He was Iranian." And I said, "Stalin was Iranian? I thought he was Russian." "Oh, no, no. He's from Gilan. It's a province. I knew exactly where it was. It's in the southwest corner of the Caspian Sea. I've even been there. And it's very tropical. They grow rice there and everything. The only place in Iran that has enough water to do that." And what are the Italians famous for? Arborio rice. So there are all these physical characteristics of the my Persian friends at dinner looked at the picture of Leon Panetta and they said, "He has an Uzbek nose. Of course he's Uzbek." And there was just this one picture of him a few months ago that I happened to see. And he had these eyes. He just was looking just the right way, or he was in the mood or something, and they were Asian eyes. And those tribes, those Iranian tribes, made the most beautiful embroidered and damask silk fabrics. And they got very, very rich selling that silk to the Roman Empire.
Right.
And so, and they're even, there's a special group of them, a tribe called the Sogdians. And I also noticed their sculptures and their artwork and certain things about them that are in the Persian Empire iconography, when Iran itself, where it is now, was an empire. So it was just so interesting to find all this out. But probably the Kirchners in Argentina are probably part of these Iranian tribes from these Iranian tribes. I actually think that what's her name? Not Dianne Feinstein, the woman who was the Speaker of the House. Oh, Nancy
Pelosi.
Yes, she has that Central Asian slim figure. She has round eyes. She doesn't have an Asian look to them because these Aryan tribes, these Iranian tribes, are not Asian. They are Aryan. And what's interesting is that almost everyone in Europe, all the populations in Europe, have a very big piece of Mongolian blood in their DNA. All of them. All of Europe.
Right, right. Well, we've come to the end of this segment, but what you mentioned about the U.S. and how you feel about the prospects of the future of the sovereignty of the re-sovereignty of the U.S. at this stage is indeed very alarming. And so we would like to ask you if you would like to come back at some point soon, and we could interview you on that subject.
Well, we should do an interview on Homeland Security.
Yes.
Because this is the really big problem now about the sovereignty, because they are the Jesuit Gestapo. And they're operating like Hitler did and the Nazis. They're fascist. They're part of the depopulation promoters and agenda. They're carrying it out. And right now, the University of California, which, you know, is the contractor on the nuclear weapons laboratories. Anyway, we have just installed or hired the new president of the University of California. She was the governor of Arizona.
Janet
Napolitano.
Napolitano.
Yes, we now have her as the president of the University of California. Immediately, FEMA and Homeland Security came in on her coattails. We have so much surveillance. We have so much electronics now. You cannot walk anywhere without getting hit with sonic bullets and frequencies that make you ill, or they slam you into the sidewalk on the ground. All of the street lights are brand new. They have all kinds of electronics and weird programs and mood control and all this garbage, surveillance cameras in them. And even on buses now, when you ride on a public bus, everybody sits there quiet. It's only the young students who are really talking, and they all have a cell phone, you know, like 4 inches from their faces. And it's completely transforming society into a transhumanist state of it's catatonic. I don't know, catatonic hypnotism or something.
Right, yeah,
it's completely dehumanizing.
Yeah. So, having now talked about how Putin was able to go in after Yeltsin sold the country out to Rothschild, who is sort of the implementer of the transhumanist agenda. Now that the U.S. presidents and oligarchs sold out the U.S. to Rothschild, it actually happened back in 1913 with the Federal Reserve Act, and it was the banks back then, all the false flags, the sinking of the Titanic, Woodrow Wilson. Perhaps we can look at the example of Vladimir Putin to see some of the strategies that he used so as to what exactly would you call it?
He was to take back sovereignty.
Yeah, to take back sovereignty
to restore
in the U.S. to restore sovereignty and to expel this occupying force of the U.S. corporation, of the Uzbek, of the Zionist banking networks. Perhaps we could begin to address that in the next interview.
Yes, and to make people realize that it's not Jews that are the enemy. There are many, many rightfully practicing religious Jews who've made huge contributions. They're not the problem. It's the satanic, Talmudic, Kabbalic, these are tribal Iranians actually, who were bred and trained and manipulated into this. And it's the Uzbek Iranians who did it so that they could always be ahead, they could always be on top, and they pump and dump cultures and societies. They steal all the libraries so that they have all the knowledge, and then they'll put a region through the dark ages so that all that corporate memory is erased, and they start out all over again with a whole fresh crop of naive recruits or people who don't know anything, and they create it in any form they want to.
So I guess that the question is whether the U.S. can be salvaged or whether it's beyond salvation. That's a question.
Well, there's the golden rule, Alfred, and the golden rule is the guy who has the gold makes the rules.
I see.
And right now, Putin has the gold. Over the last 6 years, Putin has used the overvaluing of the U.S. dollar and the undervaluing of gold to compile a pile of gold in Russia of $40 billion, 4,000 tons. No, how many? 40,000 tons. Anyway, yeah, I think 40,000 tons. And anyway, he has traded the overvalued dollar. He's bought gold, the undervalued gold with it. No, 40 tons of gold. That's how much he's bought in the last 6 years with dollars, petrodollars that he received for Russian oil and gas. And the ruble is completely backed by gold. They have gold, and I'm sure he will go back to the gold standard, because people in a lot of parts of the world don't trust paper money. When you go to the Middle East and Central Asia and Asia, there's a lot of gold trading and gold coins that are in circulation, or people wear them. In India, even the poorest beggar in the street has 22-karat gold earrings in their ears. And it's so that they have the family wealth on them in case they need it for an emergency. And I just think that a lot of things are going to change, because Putin is starting at home, restoring civil society, restoring sovereignty, and he's going to be running the global economy, especially if China and Russia join hands, and they already are. And I think that change, which is not going to be with bloodshed, it's just changing the rules of the game. It's restoring the game the way it should be played, but even better. And if the wealth is shared with everyone. And I just have a lot of hope, but also I'm not naive. I don't think that system is perfect, but Putin inherited a lot of things that he wouldn't have chosen. In fact, he came out of Yeltsin's office to be the president of Russia. So he's a special person too. But Putin is an indigenous person. He has indigenous blood. You can tell by his body shape and his face configuration, and also the way he thinks. He's very, very strategic. He's very conservative, and he does not jump around and make quick decisions. He waits and watches what people do, and then he responds in an appropriate way, or he doesn't respond. And he also picks up weapons on the battlefield that his enemies have dropped, and he uses those weapons against them. He uses their energy and their strength and everything. So I think that he's doing a purge now. He's about to dissolve the United Russia Party, which put him in office, and Medvedev as Prime Minister. He's from St. Petersburg, and one of the really big indicators was when I saw General Shoigu, who was born in a yurt in the Siberian region. He's an indigenous person. He has indigenous integrity, a tribal perspective, and he made him the secretary of the military. That's what he is now, the head of the military in Russia. But before that, he was the secretary, or the minister, I'm sorry, of the emergencies. And he was organizing those convoys to, helping to organize those convoys to Novorossiya. And he is now in charge of protecting the oil and gas fields of Siberia, his birthplace, and the Arctic. And I noticed the new Minister of Emergencies is also an indigenous person. So Putin is cleaning house from these pro-Western, spoiled St. Petersburg, selfish politicians, and he's putting indigenous people in. And let's just hope that things work out for Russia. I think they will. Things work out for Putin. I think they will. And let's just watch and see what we can do at home, how we can do this. The problem with Homeland Security and FEMA is that Janet Napolitano went to 15 countries in the Commonwealth and sold contracts for Homeland Security and FEMA to operate in their countries. And I know that Homeland Security in the United States has 2 KGB generals running it. And they were involved in 1989 in transferring the technologies of political control to the U.S. from the Soviet Union. And when I asked my lab partner what those generals were doing in 1989 at the Livermore Nuclear Weapons Lab in the middle of the Cold War, he said, oh, they're transferring these technologies to the U.S. And I said, why? He said, oh, because they're flipping the U.S. and the Soviet Union. They're turning the U.S. into the Soviet Union and the Soviet Union into the U.S. So stay away from Commonwealth countries with FEMA and Homeland Security contracts. And pray for the world. Spread this information to everyone you know, because when they hear it, they finally figure out what is really happening. It's not what's on the front page.
Great, thank you. Well, we really want to thank you, Leuren, for your work all of these years and for having taken time out to join us today. And we look forward to your joining us again in the near future on this next program.
I'd like to thank the audience. A lot of them are thanks to you for the comments they make, for the beautiful comments that we get on our website, LeurenMoret.info. And March 3rd was my birthday, and we sent that notice out in one of the press releases, and I got so many beautiful messages wishing me happy birthday and nice things they said, and about you too, and about our interviews. So I think we are making a difference. I think people understand that what we're saying is true and they need to know it. And I think that people are acting on it, they're empowered by it. So I feel like I've done something really good for humanity, and in my lifetime I feel like I've made a really important contribution, and I never expect anything for it. I'm just happy that I was able to do it and to inspire other people to do even greater things. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you.